It was past midnight and the diner was almost empty. There were just a couple of truckers, both dozing off in their seats at the back booth, and an old man nursing a cup of black coffee at the counter. I'd been working at Ruby's Diner for a couple of years now, mostly the late night shifts. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. It also meant I saw my fair share of weird stuff. But that night, things took a turn I wasn't ready for. It started when the door swung open and in walked a guy I hadn't seen before. He was tall, with messy hair and wearing a jacket that looked too big for him, the kind you'd pick up at a thrift store. But what really caught my eye was the blood. There were smears of it on his hands, dried and cracking, and his shirt was stained a dark, rusty red. "Are you alright?" I asked, trying not to sound too freaked out. He looked up at me with this dazed expression, like he didn't really know where he was. "Coffee," he mumbled. "Black." I hesitated for a second, but then grabbed the pot and poured him a cup. He didn't say anything else, just sat down at one of the booths near the window. I couldn't help but keep glancing at him while I cleaned the counter. The blood was definitely real, but he didn't seem hurt. There were no visible cuts or anything on him. I decided to give it a few minutes before calling anyone, figuring maybe he'd explain himself. But 5 minutes turned into 10 and he hadn't touched his coffee. He just sat there, staring out the window like he was waiting for something. The diner felt quieter than usual, like everything had slowed down. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are you sure you're all right? You look like you've been in an accident or something." He didn't look at me, just kept staring out the window. "It's not my blood." That stopped me in my tracks. "What do you mean it's not your blood? Whose is it?" He took a long breath, then turned to face me. His eyes were cold, empty. I don't know. I was driving, and there was this guy. He ran out in front of my car. I tried to stop, but I felt a knot form in my stomach. "You hit someone?" He nodded slowly. "I think so. But when I got out of the car to check, there was no one there, just blood everywhere." That didn't make any sense. "So you're saying you hit someone, but their body was gone?" He nodded again, more frantic this time. "I don't know what happened. I don't know if he's dead, or if I'm losing my mind." I didn't know what to say. This guy could have been drunk or on something, or maybe he was telling the truth, and there was some hurt person out there. Either way, I knew I needed to call the police. "You need to report this," I said. "If you hit someone, they could still be out there hurt." His face tightened, and for the first time he seemed angry. "I told you, I looked. There was no one there." I stepped back, my hand instinctively going to my pocket where my phone was. "I'm still going to call the cops just to be safe." Before I could pull out my phone, he slammed his fist on the table. "No cops, you don't understand. If they find out..." "Find out what?" I interrupted. "If you didn't do anything wrong, then what's the problem?" He stood up abruptly, towering over me, and for a second I thought he was going to lash out. My heart was pounding. The two truckers in the back were still asleep, and the old man at the counter didn't seem to notice what was going on. It was just me and this stranger, and I had no idea what he was capable of. "Please," he said, his voice suddenly softer, almost pleading. "Just let me sit here for a while. I need to think." I hesitated, unsure of what to do. He didn't seem stable, and the blood on him was setting off all kinds of alarm bells. But something about the way he said it, the desperation in his voice, made me pause. "All right," I said, "but I'm keeping an eye on you. You try anything and I'm calling the cops." He nodded and sat back down, staring at his untouched coffee again. I went back behind the counter, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Should I call the police anyway? What if he was telling the truth and there was some injured guy out there? As I mulled it over, the stranger suddenly stood up again. He looked out the window like he'd seen something. His whole body went tense, and he started muttering under his breath. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but it was enough to get me moving toward the phone. I picked it up and started dialing 911, but before I could finish, he spun around and shouted, "Don't!" I froze, phone halfway to my ear. "They're coming," he said, his voice shaky. "They're coming for me." "Who?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Who's coming for you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he bolted for the door, yanking it open so hard the bell above it rang like a gunshot. He ran out into the night, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, holding the phone, completely stunned. For a second I debated chasing after him, but then I decided it wasn't worth it. I dialed the police and told them what had happened, giving them a description of the guy and what he'd said about the accident. The cops showed up pretty quick, asking all kinds of questions, but there wasn't much more I could tell them. The stranger was long gone and there were no signs of him anywhere. They sent out a patrol to check the roads nearby, but as far as I know, they never found anything. A week later, I heard about a hit and run that had happened on a highway not far from the diner. A guy had been killed, but they hadn't found the driver. I couldn't help but wonder if it was him, the stranger who'd wandered into the diner that night. I never saw him again, and part of me is still haunted by what he said, that someone or something was coming for him. I started the night shift at Charlie's Diner a few months back, right after losing my job at the grocery store. The diner is one of those places that's stuck in time, checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and a jukebox in the corner that nobody ever uses. It's open 24 hours, which means someone's always here, but the night shift is usually dead. Just me, the cook, and maybe a couple of customers who wander in at odd hours. My name's Yvette. I never thought working the night shift would be anything more than boring. The worst I expected was a drunk customer or someone trying to skip on their bill, but things started to feel off a few weeks ago. It was around 2 a.m. and I was the only one in the dining area. Jerry the cook was in the back, probably watching TV like he always did. The place was empty except for one guy sitting in the far corner nursing a cup of coffee. He'd been coming in a lot lately. I didn't think much of it, regulars are common in diners, but this guy, something about him didn't sit right with me. He never said much, never ordered food, just coffee. And he always sat in that same booth like he was watching something. Or someone. I went over to refill his cup, trying to be polite. Need more coffee? He didn't look up, just nodded. His eyes were fixed on something outside, but when I glanced out the window, there was nothing there. I shrugged it off and went back behind the counter. That's when the phone rang. It was weird because we never get calls in the middle of the night. I answered, thinking maybe it was Jerry's wife or a wrong number. Charlie's Diner, how can I help you? Silence. Hello? More silence. And then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard breathing. Not heavy, not panicked, just steady breathing. It was creepy, but I figured it was some prank, so I hung up and went back to wiping down the counters. The guy in the corner hadn't moved. The next night, the same thing happened. The same customer in the same booth, staring out the window, and right around 2 a.m, the phone rang again. This time, when I picked up, there was no breathing, just the sound of something tapping. I couldn't figure out what it was, but it made my skin crawl. I hung up again, trying to ignore the feeling in my stomach. When I told Jerry about it, he just laughed. It's probably some kid messing with you, he said, flipping a burger on the grill. Happens all the time in places like this. I wanted to believe him, but the phone kept ringing, night after night, always at 2 a.m. And each time the guy in the booth was there. I started to wonder if it was him making the calls, but he never moved, never touched his phone, just stared out the window like he was waiting for something. Then, about a week ago, things got weirder. It was another slow night and the regular guy hadn't shown up yet. I was cleaning the counter when the phone rang again. I didn't want to answer, but I couldn't just let it go. I picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest. Charlie's Diner. This time there was a voice, a whisper, barely audible, but I could make out the words. He's watching you. I froze, my hand gripping the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. What did you say? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The line went dead. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. I looked around the diner expecting to see someone, but it was empty. Even Jerry wasn't in the kitchen. I rushed to the back, calling his name, but there was no answer. The grill was still on, a burger burning on the flat top, but Jerry was gone. I ran back to the front, my heart racing. The door to the diner swung open, and the regular guy walked in. He didn't say anything, just went straight to his booth and sat down, staring out the window again. I wanted to ask him if he'd seen Jerry, but something stopped me. My gut told me not to get too close to him. I stayed behind the counter watching him, waiting for something to happen. Then the phone rang again. I picked it up, my hand trembling. He's right behind you, the voice whispered. I spun around, but there was no one there. I hung up, my heart pounding in my ears. I glanced at the guy in the booth. He hadn't moved. But then I noticed something. His coffee cup. It was full. I hadn't poured him any. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, I backed away from the counter, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate. Coming from the kitchen. I bolted for the door, not caring about anything else. I needed to get out of there. But just as I reached for the handle, the lights flickered and the door wouldn't budge. I yanked on it, panic rising in my chest. It was like someone had locked it from the outside. The footsteps got closer, and I turned around, my back pressed against the door. The guy in the booth was still sitting there, staring out the window like nothing was happening. But the footsteps, they were coming from the kitchen, and they were getting louder. I ran to the phone, dialing 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice crackled through the line. There's someone in here with me, I whispered, my eyes darting around the diner. I'm at Charlie's diner, and I'm locked in. Before I could say anything else, the line went dead. The lights flickered again, and the diner plunged into darkness. I stood there, my breath coming in short gasps, waiting for something, anything. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. Then, out of nowhere, the lights came back on, and everything was normal. The guy in the booth was gone, Jerry was back in the kitchen like nothing had happened, and the door swung open easily when I tried it. I quit the next day. I don't know what was going on at that diner, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I never believed in that kind of stuff. Ghosts, spirits, or whatever people claim to see, none of it ever felt real to me. Until the night I worked a closing shift at the diner and came face to face with something I can't explain. The diner, a small old-fashioned spot off the highway in some quiet part of Pennsylvania, had always been a peaceful place to work. It was the kind of joint where regulars came in for breakfast every day, and the night shifts were slow, almost boring. I didn't mind though. It was extra cash for school, and I liked the routine. My co-worker Jess was supposed to be there that night, but she called in sick. So it was just me and Andy, the cook. He was an older guy, rough around the edges but friendly enough. We didn't talk much. He mostly kept to the kitchen while I handled the front. There weren't many customers that night, just a couple of truckers passing through and a family that came in for pie and coffee around 9 p.m. Around 10:30 things were slowing down. The family had left and the truckers were long gone. I figured I'd clean up the bathrooms early so I wouldn't have to do it right before we closed. The women's restroom was fine, just needed a quick wipe down and some toilet paper restocking. But when I got to the men's room, something felt off as soon as I walked in. The air was colder, much colder than the rest of the diner. I stood there for a second trying to figure it out. Maybe the AC was cranked up too high, or there was a draft from somewhere. But when I checked the thermostat near the kitchen, it was set to a normal temperature, and there were no windows in the bathrooms. Weird, but not enough to freak me out. I grabbed my cleaning supplies and went back in. I was halfway through wiping down the sinks when I felt it again. That cold spot. It wasn't just a slight temperature drop either. It was like walking into a freezer. It hit me as I got closer to the last stall, the one farthest from the door. I could almost see my breath. My hand hesitated on the stall door, but I told myself I was being stupid. It's just an old building, and old buildings have weird drafts. I pushed the door open, and it was empty. Of course it was. But as I stood there, a sense of unease started to creep in. The cold wasn't going away, and it felt like it was concentrated right in that stall. I finished up as fast as I could and headed back to the front, trying to shake off whatever weird feeling I had. As I was refilling the coffee machines, Andy popped his head out from the kitchen. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah, why?" "You look like you've seen something," he said with a chuckle. I forced a laugh. "Nah, just tired. The men's room is freezing though, might want to get the AC checked." Andy gave me a strange look. "There's no vent in there. It's all the same system." That caught me off guard. No vent? I knew there wasn't a window, but no vent either? I decided not to push it and just nodded, focusing back on the coffee. We only had an hour left until closing and I was ready to get out of there. The rest of the night was quiet. I started counting the register around 11:30, eager to lock up and go home. That's when it happened. I was alone up front, counting bills when I heard it. This soft, almost muffled noise coming from the back. At first, I thought it was just Andy banging around in the kitchen, but when I glanced over, I saw him standing near the kitchen door, staring at me with a confused look on his face. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Thought it was you." We both stood there for a second, listening. There it was again, a faint knock coming from the men's bathroom. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen anyone come in, and the diner was dead quiet except for us. "I'll check it out," I said, though I wasn't thrilled about the idea. The walk to the bathroom felt longer than it should have. The hallway was dimly lit, and the sound of my shoes on the tile seemed unnaturally loud. I pushed open the door to the men's room, bracing myself for whatever was inside. It was cold, just like before, the same freezing cold that made my breath fog up the mirror. And then I saw it. In the last stall, the door was slightly ajar. A shadow flickered across the floor like someone was moving behind it. My first instinct was to turn and run, but I forced myself to move forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the stall and pushed the door open, empty, just like before. But the cold was unbearable now, sinking into my bones, making it hard to breathe. That's when I saw it, in the reflection of the mirror above the sink. There was someone standing behind me just for a split second. A figure tall and dark with no face, no features, just there. I spun around, but the bathroom was empty. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I managed to stumble out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Andy was waiting in the hallway, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, trying to catch my breath, "but I'm not sticking around to find out." We locked up the diner as fast as we could. I didn't say much to Andy after that. He seemed just as shaken as I was. We left the diner together, and I drove home in silence, replaying what I'd seen over and over in my head. The next day I called in sick. I wasn't ready to go back, not after what happened. When I finally did return to work a few days later, I avoided the men's room. Whatever was in there, I didn't want any part of it. I quit that job a month later. Andy did too. We never talked about it again, but every time I drive past that diner, I get this feeling in the pit of my stomach, like something is still watching from that last stall. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel.